Today we are looking at an 1873 disappearance in Lowell, Massachusetts, centered on a young mill worker named Annie Brook and the night she failed to return to her boarding house. Rain hissed along the Merrimack River, the mill clock struck 9, and a blue-shawled girl stepped off the footbridge. After that, every witness agrees on the weather but not on where she went. Her time card ends cleanly at the evening bell. Her bed was turned down at Mrs. Keegan's, and her lunch pail reappeared 2 days later on a windowsill nobody admits touching. You're watching True Crime Files. Don't forget to subscribe for more cases like this. In the early 1870s, Lowell moved to the rhythm of belts and flywheels, carding rooms and weave sheds. The brick mills on the river threw steam and lint into the air, and their windows at dusk glowed like rows of furnace mouths. Wages were meager, hours long, yet the boarding houses were tidy and watched over by keepers who minded curfews and reputations. A city built to the beat of cotton frames also kept a strict ledger of girls who came and went, which is why one empty pillow drew attention by sunrise. Factories set the season. Winter meant frozen canal lips and stiff leather boots, spring smelled of oil and wet timber. 1873 brought a tremor through the economy as banks in New York began to wobble, and orders softened on the loom floors. But mills still ran on schedule. At Blake and Teal No. 2, the second shift ended at 9, and the gate watchman checked faces beneath soaked bonnets as the line streamed into the drizzle. That's where Annie, 19, small and steady at a power loom, should have been counted, if you trust the watchman's memory. Annie boarded with Mrs. Nora Keegan on Dutton Street, fourth bed in a room of 6. She kept her hair pinned, her hymnbook tucked between 2 folded shirtwaists, and a small brooch of paste stones set in brass. She sent coins home to her mother in New Hampshire every third Friday. She walked with Mary Doyle, a friend from Cards and Suppers, and they shared tea before the bell most nights. These are the simple facts. The difficult ones begin with the Friday rain and a rumor of new work in Lawrence that tempted several girls to consider a move. Key figures came quickly into focus. There was Ezra Pike, the foreman in Room E, who counted Annie's output and pushed the speed of her loom. There was a loom fixer named Albert Greeley, quick with his hands and quicker with gossip. There was the gate watchman, Silas Reed, who never hurried and never smiled. There was Mrs. Keegan, practical, pious, ruler of breakfasts. And there was an assistant city marshal named Josiah Penn who kept his hat brim low and wrote in a neat, square hand. They would orbit Annie's gap in the record like moths around a dark pane. The inciting moment surfaced as soon as the bell tower's hands crept to 9. Mary waited by the spooling tables with 2 other girls, expecting to meet Annie for the walk to Dutton Street. The overseer dismissed them, and the girls made for the yard, as Mary later put it. Mary remembered seeing Annie at her loom just before cleanup, tying off a final warp. She did not see her at the cloak peg. She did not see the blue shawl. She stepped into the mist, checked the alley, and decided Annie left early by the south stairs. It was a small guess that would grow into a large problem. Witnesses are messy, even in an orderly city. The night bellman at the boarding house swore he saw Annie's shawl at 10, folded on a chair by the stove. Mrs. Keegan disagreed. She saw only damp shawls belonging to the Sullivan sisters. A boy from the Cooper's yard claimed he passed a girl with Annie's walk on the footbridge, heading toward the lighted barges tied along the eastern canal. A motorman swore he spotted a lone female figure under the bridge with a watchman. The river took their words, turned them over like pebbles, and left them rounded and hard to place. What we can place is a small chain of tangible things. On Saturday morning, Annie's bed stayed made. Her trunk sat locked. Her brooch, the one with the paste stones, rested in a saucer the way she always kept it when she washed. Her work shoes were gone, her shawl was missing, and her lunch pail wasn't on its nail. On Sunday evening, the pail turned up on the windowsill outside the cloakroom at the mill, wiped clean, as if no one had eaten that Friday at all. Who moved it, and why do that after she was already missed? Marshall Penn began where mills begin, paper. He verified her time card, a stiff rectangle marked to the minute. He checked the gate book and found no mark by her name at 9. He interviewed Ezra Pike, who disapproved of the girls talking union talk, but insisted his eyes were on the numbers, not the women. He spoke with Silas Reed at the gate, who delivered the kind of calm, unhelpful answers that sound practiced even when they might be true. Then Penn walked the footbridge himself, listened to the rain working the river, and marked where boards creaked underfoot. The sound stayed with him as he set the first search in motion. The river and canals were immediate suspects. Men with poles prodded the banks. Lightermen scanned snags near the locks. A diver in a heavy canvas suit, hired from Boston for a day, dragged a weighted line along the canal bed. Lint floated in feathers on the surface, catching in eddies like white moths. They pulled up nothing but a half-rotted barrel hoop and the skull of a small animal. In this case, absence sounded louder than discovery, and yet the water kept its own counsel. The geography mattered. Blake and Teal No. 2 stood a short walk from the footbridge and a longer walk from the depot. Boarding houses lined Dutton Street like linked beads. The eastern canal reached northward like a second street, paralleling the factory fronts. If Annie meant to slip away to Lawrence, the depot lay west, not toward the river. If she meant a clandestine meeting, the shadowed underside of the bridge offered cover but not privacy. Watchmen used it to avoid the rain. If she fell, someone would have heard a cry in the echoing, wood-roofed space. Did anyone? Mary Doyle carried a different memory to Marshall Penn on the second day. She recalled how, the week before, the foreman suggested she and Annie switch looms to test output. Annie declined, it would cut her tally for the month. Pike held her at her post. Later, Mary heard Pike tell the loom fixer to see to Annie's let-off in a tone that wasn't just mechanical. Small, ordinary power moved around the room like current along the belts. Mary didn't say the word harassment, but the shape of it hovered over the table as she spoke. Penn asked quiet questions in loud spaces. The mill turned while the case grew, wages depended on it. He learned that a watch key had been found on the south stair 2 days before the rain. He found that a roll of factory twine had gone missing from room E. He discovered that a cloth-covered trunk shipped out of the freight depot that Saturday was light for its size, lightly billed, and consigned to an address in Newburyport with a name no one at the mill recognized. The trunk arrived empty at the receiving office on Monday, which was entirely ordinary, except that the receipt mentioned a faint odor of river mud. By midweek, the newspapers called it a cautionary mystery, then sharpened their language as papers do. The Lowell Daily Courier printed a column-long speculation about a suitor of no account. The Boston Journal sent a man to check the boarding house times of other girls and, in a short that lives in the archive, described Annie's demeanor as careful. That word, careful, echoed in Penn's notes. He underlined it, then circled the lunch pail line. He returned to the mill on Thursday evening and stood in the cloakroom while the second shift clocked out. Steam drifted under the door. Boots clattered. A mangle squealed somewhere beyond the wall. He watched as a cleaner shaped lint into a ball and knocked it into a basket. He saw the windowsill where the lunch pail had sat. Rain scored the glass. In that frame of wet light, he noticed a smear of blue dye on the sill edge, a hue that matched the cheaper indigo shawls sold at the haberdasher on Central Street. The smear led nowhere, but it gave him permission to ask who had access to dye that could stain wood. Dye turned up with the loom fixer. Greeley wore it on his fingers and cuffs. He shrugged, every fixer did. But the twine from room E mattered more. Penn found the missing spool under a trap stair near the south exit. The end had been knotted 3 times, each knot crushed flat, as if pulled hard against an edge. He pocketed the short piece and let the long remain, then climbed to the foreman's office. Ezra Pike kept notes, output figures, oil allotments, fines docked for lateness. He also kept an old ledger in a drawer no one else used, and here Penn found a different record, the names of 3 girls transferred from room E in the past year, each mark followed by a single letter, P, S, or R. P could stand for poor output. S could stand for sick. But R. When Penn asked, Ezra's mouth thinned. Resigned, he said. Resigned without a week's notice, without collecting due wages, and without leaving forwarding addresses. The first turn came not from Ezra but from the rivermen. On Friday morning, as the searchers worked below the locked gates, a boot surfaced in a churn of bubble and lint. It was a woman's boot, narrow, with 6 eyelets and a cut at the back seam that had been stitched with neat, small hands. Inside, wedged by silt, lay a watch key, plain brass, scoured bright. Mary identified the boot by the repair mark. Mrs. Keegan nodded once and looked at the floor. The key, Penn noted, belonged to a cheap watch that Annie did not own. The second turn arrived with weather. The rain cleared, wind shifted, and the river dropped an inch. At a snag near the west bank, a blue cloth tangled against the root ball. It was not a shawl but a scarf, and the dye ran when touched. Penn, careful as a clerk, blotted it and bagged it. Back at the mill he compared it to a sample from Room E, where fabric in that shade was being tested for a buyer in Providence. The weave matched. The thread count matched. The knot in the short twine sample he'd pocketed matched a knot in a loop tied around the scarf's corner, a loop someone might use to pull from a height or to secure in a hurry. Penn's questions narrowed. He asked again where Ezra was at 9 on Friday. Ezra said he was in the counting room with the clerk, balancing fines. The clerk took a long time to answer the same. Penn asked where Silas Reed waited when the rain blew across the gate. Under the east lintel, Silas said, which would have put him out of sight of the south stair. Penn asked whether Greeley had gone above the frame floor that night. Greeley said he did not leave Room E. A carding hand contradicted him. Contradictions gathered like lint under a table, then caught fire when someone kicked. The turning point was a crate. Freight office clerks admitted they shipped a cloth-covered trunk to Newburyport on Saturday, but 2 crates, they added, were dropped from the order at the last minute, both originally designated for a warehouse behind the mill offices. The cancelled crates were returned to the mill. When Penn inspected them, he found corners scuffed with river sand and a faint line of blue, the same dye, along one inside plank. He found no blood, no hair, nothing the eye wants as proof, but the scent narrative sharpened: wet rope, dye, river mud, haste. Searchers widened their loop to the bank below the south stair. There, caught in a root tangle, they discovered one more item, Annie's brooch. The brass was bent, one paste stone missing. The pin was open, not snapped. The brooch had been kept at the boarding house, in a saucer by the wash bowl. Mary had seen it every morning. Why was it now near the stair that led to the canal? Someone moved it. The question was whether the move happened before she vanished, as a keepsake carried on a whim, or after, as a planted breadcrumb. By the second week, rumors hardened into stances. Girls whispered that Ezra cornered them between looms and corrected posture with his hand. The overseer claimed a group of the younger ones brought excitable notions into the room. Papers printed photographs of the footbridge and the mill gate. The river gave nothing else back. Penn made the uncomfortable choice. He arrested Ezra Pike on suspicion, not of murder, there was no body, but of unlawful restraint and foul play leading to a disappearance. The charge fit the era's language awkwardly and left room for the defense to slide. Ezra, taken from his office in a gray coat with a ledger under his arm, walked to the jail without speaking. Silas Reed stood at the gate and watched them go. Greeley ducked into a doorway and swore he needed to check a frame. The preliminary hearing gathered town into a room with polished benches and open windows. The prosecutor, a young man named Orrin Bliss, built a staircase of circumstantial steps: the missing twine, the dyed scarf, the crate with river sand, the brooch near the south stair, the watch key in the boot, the changes in girls' assignments in Ezra's ledger. No single thumbprint, he said, though that word was not yet law, but many smudges on the same page. The defense, older and fond of the word speculation, rested on silence where a body should have been. "We cannot try a river," he said. "We can only chase echoes." Mary's testimony mattered most. She admitted she had not seen Annie at the cloak peg that Friday. She admitted she had assumed the south stair. She admitted that a week before, while wrapping spools, she heard Ezra tell Greeley to see to Annie's let off in a tone that made her arm hairs rise. The defense asked if tones could be put on a scale and measured. Mary answered, "I know what I know." Her voice was clear, the room seemed to hang on the plainness. Then the gate watchman spoke, and his calm came under its first crack. He had said he stood under the east lintel at 9. Under gentle questions, he agreed that he sometimes took half steps out to read faces. Under a sharper question, he admitted that he left the gate for mere moments, when the rain slanted, because he did not want his ledger wet. "Who kept the gate?" asked Bliss. "The rain kept the gate," Reed said, and the room felt the shape of a gap wide enough for a girl to slip through. The judge sent the case to trial, not for murder but for a set of charges linked to coercion and unlawful detention resulting in disappearance. It was an awkward fit, and yet it fit the reality that no body had surfaced. Over the next month, the city settled into its bated breath. Mills ran. Girls kept time. On certain nights, small groups of women walked together past the footbridge, not quite daring to look down. At trial, the details took on the weight of ritual. Bliss called the freight clerk who described the cancelled crates. He called the diver from Boston who described feeling for obstructions in the dark. He called a haberdasher who testified about the cheap indigo shawls and the way the dye bled when wet. He called Mary, again, who added one more detail: Annie had been collecting small coins and asking about trains to Lawrence. The defense pounced. She was likely to run, they said. No need for a villain if a young woman sought a better job. Bliss countered with the lunch pail on the windowsill, the kind of domestic horror that sticks. "Who set it back?" he asked, voice low. "Who wants us to believe the day ended in its proper place?" He held up the pail like a clock with stopped hands. "Isn't this the memory of a shift put to bed after the girl who owned it was already gone?" The jurors watched the pail, the dull tin reflecting window light. The object said little, but it coordinated with the dye, the twine, and the scarf. Ezra finally spoke. He denied cornering Annie. He denied using the south stair at 9. He admitted the ledger annotations but called them the counting marks. He did not explain why R might stand for resigned when the girls listed had not collected due pay. He looked toward the watchman while saying the gate was properly kept. It was not a confident exchange. Yet the defense did not need confidence, it needed doubt that matched the shape of the river. The verdict came down after 2 days. The jury found Ezra guilty on the lesser charge of unlawful restraint and conspiracy to conceal a disappearance, not guilty on the implied charge that connected those acts to death. The judge, sober and irritated by the missing body, sentenced him to 10 years at Charlestown State Prison. He said the city would not abide coercion behind factory doors. In the back row, women from several boarding houses sat with hands folded. Annie's mother, brought down from New Hampshire in a borrowed dress, did not look at Ezra when he turned to go. What of Silas Reed, the watchman whose ledger stayed dry? Penn tried to build a case for negligence, perhaps corruption. But Reed had an answer for every question that stuck to him. He stayed at his post, he said, except when rain slanted. He never escorted anyone under the bridge. He never carried a pail. He could not help what the river hid. He kept the gate until the mill let him go, quietly, 3 months later, for reasons unrelated to the case, reasons that may have included a ledger somebody finally read. Aftermath is the territory of consequences and residue. Mrs. Keegan began to lock the boarding house door at 9:15, not 10. Girls paired up for walks and learned to name the space between what a foreman can ask and what he cannot. Blake and Teal posted a notice that discipline would be handled by 2 men together, never one, which solved nothing and suggested they understood something had gone wrong. The city council convened a committee and heard testimony about gatekeeping practices. They recommended better lighting at the south stair and a second watchman during evening dismissal. The Mills balked, then hired a boy for half pay to stand in a pool of lamplight. Charlestown held Ezra for 2 years. Then the economy tightened further, Mills throttled back, and a petition, signed by men who hated the precedent of a foreman punished for what they called misinterpretations, made its way to Boston. The governor commuted Ezra's sentence to time served plus a fine. He left the prison thinner and unphotographed. He took a job in where he drank. He died before 50, a line in a church ledger that explains nothing. The river kept Annie. For years, boys fished the banks and pulled up lures snagged on roots. Spring thaws loosened timber. Cloth faded to threads. In 1877, a lock tender found a fragment of shoe leather and a brass brooch pin caught in a seam of mud. He delivered both to the police. Penn, older, held the pin under a candle and remembered the paste stones. The metal had pitted, the clasp would never close again. He put it in a paper packet, sealed it with wax, and wrote 3 words, possibly the girl. Legacy is quiet, then it becomes a policy. Lowell eventually installed better gate lamps. Boarding houses formed their own committees to accompany younger girls home if they worked the late bell. A women's benevolent society began a ledger of grievances, tiny lines written in tidy hands that documented squeezes on shoulders, corners of rooms, late fines applied capriciously, and disappearances that turned out to be marriages, and one that was not. The city learned to listen a little sooner. Not fast. Not enough. But sooner. There were unresolved threads. The lunch pail's second journey, from nail to sill, never attached itself to a hand. The scarf's dye tied the mill to the river but not a specific man to a knot. The watch key in the boot suggested a borrowed pocket, a dropped object, or a staged sign. The cancelled crates hung between inference and proof. Every piece pointed, and yet the path between them remained a plank walk above dark water. In a case like this, the absence is a character with its own lines. What does the case reveal about its era and its system? That a city designed to control time struggled to account for 1 hour. That power in a room full of machines can be exercised in a glance as easily as in a shove. That a young woman's reputation weighed as much in court as a piece of twine. That industrial order is not the same as safety. The mills hummed on, and the river turned under them. On certain nights, when the clock set the second shift free and rain stung along the Merrimack, some said they saw a figure on the footbridge pause as if waiting for the missing key detail to return. They went home, counted their steps, and closed their doors. The case never accrued a gravestone or a plaque. It lived instead in the changed habits of women who held each other's elbows on wet boards and in a single paper packet with a brooch pin that might be a memory, and might be the smallest proof. In that narrow space between what we can hold and what we can only name, Annie's hour continues to pass.